Hi, Matthew Moran. I am a software engineer, technology professional, author, and a songwriter and performer. I'm also an atheist. The goal of this video is to share my deconstruction story, although I prefer to refer to it as my emancipation from unreasonable beliefs. And I'm going to cover a variety of things. It will certainly not be my complete story. I want to make this video brief enough to be watchable quickly. Also, I am more than happy to entertain and respond to legitimate questions, either about how I arrived at this conclusion and even challenges to the things I believe. I am always open to conversation. I don't get angry at people who disagree with me. I enjoy the interaction, so no problem there. I spent 26 years as a born-again evangelical Christian. And during that time, much of it was spent teaching and studying apologetics, as well as theology, but apologetics was an area of study that I enjoyed immensely and I was good at. So in this video, we'll cover my backstory, how I became a Christian, and kind of my experience with the church. We're going to cover how I discarded my belief and what that process was like. And then I'm going to also address a few interesting responses I get from Christians, particularly friends that I know through the church who have responded or commented on my atheism. I was not raised in a particularly religious home. My mother was raised Catholic, but she didn't really attend Catholic church. As a matter of fact, once when I was attending church, she said to me, "Matt, why don't you attend Catholic church?" And I said, "Mom, why don't you attend Catholic church?" And she laughed and said, "I find it boring." My father went to a parochial school, but he never spoke about religion. I don't think it was a very important part of his life for sure. Both my parents were in medicine, and both were scientifically minded. As a matter of fact, we had a very kind of broad set of people and information that was in our home, whether cultural or intellectual and educational. So we had science books around and history books, and we were encouraged to explore virtually any idea. And I'm super appreciative of that. However, I had a child very young. I have 4 children. I began having children young. And when I had my first child, I was struggling a bit about how I would provide him moral guidance. How do I answer the big questions of life? I had been introduced to C.S. Lewis first when I was a teenager, just because I read science fiction fantasy. I'd read the Chronicles, the Chronicles of Narnia, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the other books in that series. I knew it was an allegory to the gospel, or at least the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was. But that didn't really have much of an impact. But it did introduce me to his book, Mere Christianity. And I found the book very compelling and interesting, and that may have played a part. But at some point, I found myself at a growing non-denominational church in our area. And I began really diving into some of the classes there. And after maybe a year or so, maybe half a year, I accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior. I made a profession of faith in that church. And almost immediately, I jumped into just a lot of learning and then ultimately teaching. I took the Foundations of Faith class, several Navigators classes, and I just love the idea of teaching. I always have. I teach technology, I teach music, and it's just a big part of what I do. I've written 2 books about careers in technology. I mentor some musicians, I mentor some technologists, I mentor some writers as well. So it's a big part, something I've always loved doing. And I immediately jumped into teaching and rewrote the Foundations of Faith curriculum for that church. And then I began studying some of the apologetics teachers. So Norman Geisler and J.P. Moreland, Josh McDowell, and I began listening to and getting material from Greg Koukl's Stand to Reason radio show, and jumped into it enough that I responded to a article that Richard Bozarth of the American Atheist wrote. It was published as an op-ed piece in the newspaper. And I sent him an email and challenged him a bit, and we had a back and forth that was pretty fun. And at some point, I forwarded that back and forth to the pastor of my church, And he contacted me and said, hey, I want to meet with you. And he asked me to help him start an apologetics ministry at the church. And there was another individual. And I began putting together an apologetics curriculum. I began teaching. I would do study for the pastor. And this continued through that church and another large church in the area, and then a church in Arizona. And I've taught in front of large churches, so it was a big part of my life. And I was good at it. I had fun with it, and I took seriously this idea of sharing my faith and doing so in an intellectual manner. I didn't have any problem with the church. I wasn't angry at the church, and I was also a bit iconoclastic at the church as well. I would challenge Christians for what they believed. I actually taught a class at our church called "Is It Worse to Say God Damn It or God Told Me?" challenging the idea of personal revelation, when I would claim that at that time the Bible was your true source of inspiration and inklings and feelings were not good enough to call them from God. And by the way, I still believe that. In 2008, I went through a divorce, and I had a very difficult time with that divorce, and just big emotional time. And after that, I started to take stock of my life, stock of what I believed. And this kind of dovetailed with another experience, an experience I had when I was a Christian. So I used to take the train into work. I met an individual on the train who was a city council person, and a very interesting individual. I cannot remember who it was. I probably should be able to remember that. We would have conversations on the train about culture, about politics, about music, whatever it was, and sometimes we agreed about things, sometimes we didn't. But he shared an idea that I really took to heart. I found super interesting. He said, we should periodically challenge our strongest held beliefs and put them up against the scrutiny of new information and new perspectives to see if they make it through. And I did that with a lot of my beliefs over the years, but I had never really done it with religion, not in a way that was honest, in a way where I truly scrutinized it. Because when you study apologetics, you tend to study answers to people you disagree with rather than studying the topics in general. I'd gone through this divorce, and I had really stopped attending church. And I think this is a good thing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I was busy raising my daughter. I was busy working on my career and busy making music. I began to become fascinated with cosmology and physics first. And I started watching college lectures and presentations on the topic. I just found it hugely fascinating, and still do. This expanded to biology. Occasionally I'd get into a broader study of history as well. And it's something that continues to this day. And I watch college level lectures. Now, I am by no means an expert in any of those fields, even though I spend a fair amount of time, maybe 1 to 3 college lectures every week, if not more at times. But I'm not doing a course of study. I'm not being tested on the material. It's a casual, although passionate interest. But what I was struck with was the way the scientific method assessed information and the way scientists spoke about things like knowledge and what we can know. And it was very much a contrast with what you heard in religious circles, because there is a sense of true and absolute knowledge. When you are a Christian, you believe you have the truth. And science looks at it very differently. It looks at it as, we are exploring this, we have a model, we think we have evidence for the model, here is the evidence, here's why it tracks to what reality looks like. And when it doesn't track, or when new information comes in, they either modify the model or disband it and adopt something new. And that's been the case with science since certainly since the Enlightenment. Doesn't mean science hasn't gotten things wrong. In fact, it does, but science corrects itself. You really don't see that with religious thinking. And this really struck me. It was something that, once again, because I had stepped outside of the day-to-day at church hearing the message, it really stuck out as very clear that there's a different way of talking about how we assess data and how we assess what is true. And over time, I came to realize that I had, in fact, become an atheist. And that's kind of the important thing. It wasn't some moment, there wasn't some one argument. I didn't suddenly go, I didn't wake up one day and say, oh my gosh, I don't believe this now because of this thing I saw. It was really gradual over time. And I suddenly thought, I have no good reason to hold on to the beliefs I used to. More so, it was an honest assessment of how I was assessing information, which was very clearly not using skepticism. Because if you use skepticism honestly, you can't place God in those places where I don't know belongs, which is what really the bulk of Christians do. I would say all Christians. They either rely on personal experience, or this seems so outrageous, or we can't understand this, therefore God must be there. And unfortunately, throughout history, that's just been proven to be a bad way to assess knowledge, because God used to exist in famine, and God used to exist in the storm and the volcanoes and weather and all those things, and now we know better. And there's no reason to believe that this trend is going to change in the near future. If it does, if the evidence proves me wrong, then I will have to modify my belief. But that's what led me away from my faith, was just recognizing that. I've had conversations with friends that I know through the church. I still have friends who attend church. I spend less time just because I'm not at church. But the reality is I had some good friends there. I didn't have some experience where like I hate the church and I'm angry. And they bring up some very interesting topics when it comes to my atheism. The first thing they'll say, and this is very common, I am positive I said the same thing, and it's kind of cringy to even think of, but they'll say something like, you were never actually a Christian. Now, let's explore that for a minute. First of all, if it comes to belief, meaning, did I believe in Jesus? Did I believe that I needed to be saved from my sin? Did I believe that he died and on the cross for my sins and was raised? Yes, I believed all those things. So in belief, I was sincerely a Christian. However, if what they mean is, am I condemned by a God who is evaluating my moral standing in the world? And was there a person who died on the cross 2,000 years ago and actually raised from the dead and actually offers salvation? In that regard, no, I was never a Christian, because I don't believe such things exist. I don't believe there's a God who's judging me in that way, and I don't believe there's any person in history who's ever been raised from the dead. So because of that, because there's no evidence for that, I certainly was not a Christian in that regard. But I also don't believe that you, as a Christian, are a Christian either, no matter how sincerely you believe it. And so in that regard, neither one of us are Christians. Now, the other thing they say is, you just have discarded your faith because you want to sin. And that's an interesting idea, a weird assessment that they think they're inside my head. I like what Ricky Gervais said. He had this in Afterlife, but I've heard him say it otherwise. And other people have said something similar. When asked, if you don't believe in God, then why don't you go out and rape and murder anybody you want to? And he said, I do. I rape and murder everybody I want to, which is no one. There's this idea that, if you don't believe in God, you're going to become this immeasurably evil person. And the reality is, if your connection to ethical and good behavior that is good for society, is bound to your belief in God, you're probably not a very good person. I believe that good behavior from a societal standpoint, what is effective for society, is evolutionary. We see it in all kinds of species. We see altruism and behaviors to protect the young, and a behavior to keep the society safe. All those things are very true in, with crows and with primates and any number of species that have those behaviors to one degree or another. We're simply an ape that is able to evaluate those behaviors, and that's the only reason we're a little bit different. But other than that, we behave like bonobos and chimpanzees do. Another thing that's odd that they'll say is, you've been indoctrinated by science or by the world. And I am certain, once again, that I said this when I was a Christian to people who either left the faith or were not Christians, that, you've been indoctrinated. And I see this charge all the time. As a matter of fact, I see it in regard to education and universities. Universities are indoctrinating our children. Let's think about this indoctrination claim. This is coming from people who, me included, who had my kids in Sunday school from the time they were 1, 2, 3, had them in programs like Awana. So they were getting indoctrination every Sunday. They were getting it at home when we read them Bible stories and had Bible movies. They were getting it on Wednesdays when they went to Awana, when they went to their youth groups. And they did this, and they were being told at the most impressionable time of their life, when they are least capable of assessing what is real and what isn't. They were being told there is a person who lives up in the sky, who sees everything you do, who knows everything you think. And furthermore, they will send you to hell if you don't believe in Jesus, right? Now, that is indoctrination of the highest order. So it's a little bit wild to make the claim that universities or science are indoctrinating people when this is what's going on in religion. I call bullshit on the indoctrination claim. One of the things I want to cover also is this idea of a God that is judging me for my, for how I behave or how I think. And I really kind of thought about it with cosmology. This is one of the things that really kind of exposed the facade of this idea, this self-centered notion of our place in the universe. As you study cosmology and you realize that there are likely, certainly billions, if not trillions of galaxies, each of those galaxies with billions of stars. And we're on one small little rock in one little section of one of those galaxies. And the perfect being, the one with all the knowledge, all the power, who created not just our galaxy with 100,000 light years across and billions of stars and billions of planets, he created all the other billions or trillions of galaxies. But he is super obsessed and super angry at how this particular ape on this one little rock is behaving. It is a ludicrous idea. That doesn't mean it's not true, but it does mean that if it is true, if there is a God who is the most powerful, most intelligent, most capable being in all of the cosmos, if he is focused on an ape like that, he or her are entirely ludicrous. To the person questioning your belief, first of all, for some people, it's really rough. They grew up very severely indoctrinated, a fear of hell, a fear of ostracization from the group. That happens for sure. And I can't speak to how you should handle that. There are groups that do that, like Freedom from Religion Foundation, which you should definitely check out. I can tell you, and this might be a byproduct, well, it's a byproduct of two things. One, I wasn't raised in a home where sin was talked about, right? I wasn't raised in a home where I was taught God was ready to condemn me. So my belief in that came later. So I never spent a lot of time thinking about it and thinking about hell. What I want you to understand is, first of all, I'm here if you want to ask any questions. If you look in the description, I'll have a way to get in contact with me. This is true for anybody who sees this. If you want to, that's fine. Once again, any legitimate, sincere question, I'm happy to answer. I'm a pretty transparent person and happy to give you whatever guidance I can in this arena. But if you're questioning your belief and you're wondering what you're going to do, there is an entire set of communities of atheists or free thinkers or really a-religious people, just secular, not really tied to atheism or religion or any religious belief. There are groups doing great things to make the world better, to have fun and have outings, and really to provide a sense of community. So you should look for those in your area because you might find that you're missing less than you thought you would. And I would encourage you to do that. And if you're questioning your faith, just continue the journey with a skeptical honesty to look at the things you believe and why you believe them, and set up some kind of epistemology, a method for determining what is true. And if you do that, I think you'll be in pretty good shape. Now, regard to Freakshow Confidential, I started this channel, I don't know, a year ago when I started my Substack. I haven't really been using it, but I plan on doing that more. We have a desire to create more videos about religion and skepticism and just culture and society related to what I think are good ideas, and also anything that crosses my desk that I find interesting. And if that sounds like it might be interesting to you, I'd love it if you subscribed and certainly liked this video, shared it. And also, once again, leave me a comment or leave me a question. I'd love to field those. And we'll be back at you in about a week or so. Thanks.